His hand rose slowly. She did not move away from it. His fingers came to rest against her left cheek, the pads of them, light and deliberate against the scarred skin. And the morning room was full of sunshine, and the whole world contracted to that single point of contact, and he traced the edge of the largest scar, from jaw to temple. Slowly, the way you trace something you have been thinking about for a long time and are finally, irrevocably, close enough to reach. She had braced for 9 different shapes of discomfort. She had catalogued them over 9 years, learned to identify each one in the first fraction of a second. The flicker down, the careful not seeing, the performed indifference, the stiff civility of a man reminding himself of his obligations. She was prepared for all of them. None of them came. What came instead was a man with grief and fury in his expression, and something beneath both of them, raw, unguarded, more frightening than either, looking at her face in the clear May light as though it were the most specific and important thing he had ever been close enough to see. "This is not damage," he said, very low. "This is the map of what you survived." She had promised herself she would not cry. It was of no use whatsoever. Welcome to aristocratic hearts. She was invisible. For 9 years, society looked right through her as though she were made of glass. No, not glass. Glass catches the light. She was simply nothing. A footnote. A woman the ton had collectively decided was too marked, too damaged, too long past her reasonable window to warrant even a moment of genuine attention. And then one night, the most dangerous man in England decided she was the only thing he could see. This is Aristocratic Hearts, and tonight's story is one you will not forget. But first, where in the world are you listening from? I love knowing that this community spans from Tokyo to Toronto, from Lagos to London, from every time zone and every circumstance. Drop your city and your local time in the comments below. We are scattered across the globe, and yet we are all here together, connected by these stories. Now, our story takes place in London in the spring of 1824, during a season so glittering and so merciless that even the chandeliers seem to cut. And it begins not with the Duke, though we will come to him soon enough, but with the woman. It always begins with the woman. Her name was Lucinda Vane, and she had spent 9 years learning how to survive in a world that had decided she should not. Let me tell you what happened to her face. Before we step fully into the story, it is important to understand the world that Lucinda Vane inhabited. Because without understanding the rules of that world, you cannot understand what it cost her to endure them, or what it meant when someone finally burned them down. In 1824, England, a woman's entire future rested on the season. Those frantic months between April and July, when Parliament was in session, when families flooded London from their country estates, when every ball and dinner and garden party was in truth a marriage market operating on ruthless commercial principles. Families spent thousands of pounds on gowns, on carriages, on townhouse rentals near the fashionable squares, all of it invested in a single hope, securing a respectable match before time ran out. A young woman was typically given 3 seasons to find a husband. 3. After that, she began to be described in whispers as on the shelf. After 5, the whispers became open commentary. After 9 seasons without a single formal offer, a woman was not merely on the shelf. She was the shelf itself. She was the cautionary tale that mothers told their daughters as they dressed for their first ball. She was proof of what happened when a woman failed at the only task that mattered. When Lucinda Vane attended the Castleton Ball on the 15th of May, 1824, she had attended 9 of them, and every single one had been exactly like this. Lucinda Vane was not always the woman society dismissed. At 18, she had been unremarkable in the way that most young women are unremarkable at 18. Neither a great beauty, nor emphatically otherwise. Somewhere in the warm and uncontroversial middle ground, with dark, honey-coloured eyes and dark hair that had a tendency toward unruliness in damp weather, and a mind that was quick and curious, and had been carefully, thoroughly trained to deploy itself only in the limited and appropriate directions available to young women of her station. Domestic management, gentle conversation, pianoforte, and the particular skill of making intelligent observations inside your own head while saying something entirely unremarkable out loud. Her father, Sir Charles Vane, was a retired barrister of moderate success who had spent the first 3 of Lucinda's seasons as a genuinely hopeful participant in the project, and the subsequent 6 as a man who had quietly reclassified the endeavour from investment to obligation. He was not cruel. He was not deliberately unkind. He was, as many disappointed fathers of unmarried daughters were in that era, simply a man who had wanted something to go a particular way and found it painful when it didn't, and who had resolved that pain by the gradual withdrawal of expectation until the withdrawal itself became the only expectation remaining. He rarely asked about the season anymore. He rarely asked about much. Her mother had died when Lucinda was 12, consumption, swift and brutal, in the middle of an unusually cold winter, and she had been, in the years after, primarily raised by an elderly housekeeper named Mrs. Prewitt, who loved her with the fierce loyalty of a woman for whom love had been demonstrated mostly through practical competence, and who had taught her to keep accounts and manage a household and hold her chin up in rooms that did not want her. There. Mrs. Prewitt was the closest thing Lucinda had to family beyond her father. She had died 3 years ago. Lucinda felt her absence at strange moments, at the beginning of a season, when there was no one else who would say, "You look well. Go in there and be exactly who you are." She had a modest dowry and a reputation for being sensible, which in the language of the marriage market meant she was expected to attract someone decent, but not someone remarkable, and for the first year she had believed that was sufficient. She had gone to the balls and the morning calls and the subscription concerts and the afternoon visits with the careful hope of a young woman who has been told she has reasonable prospects and intends to make the most of them. And then Lord Gerald Stern had come calling. She had met him in the 2nd week of her very first season, at a dinner party hosted by a family with more ambition than taste, and she had identified him almost immediately as the kind of man she had read about in novels and hoped to avoid in life. He was 7 years her senior, a 3rd son of a viscount, handsome in a way that relied entirely on the tailoring of his coat, and possessed of an easy charm that was, on examination, the charm of a man who had never in his 31 years been told no, and had arranged his entire character around that fact. She was polite. She was civil. She declined his offer to walk with her in the garden because something about the way he watched her, too close, too certain, too soon, made the fine hairs rise along her arms. He had not been pleased. The pressure came in increments, as such pressure always does. First the flattery, intensified past comfort. Then the strategic positioning, arranging to appear beside her at every social event, making it seem to observers as though an attachment were established, as though the outcome were settled. Then, when she had managed to make it as clear as a young woman of her circumstances could, make anything, through every carefully worded and impeccably polite refusal available to her, that she was not interested, and had never been interested. Then it stopped being charming entirely. Now here is something important about what a visible rejection meant for a man like Gerald Stern in 1824 England. A gentleman's social standing rested on a particular kind of perceived power, controlled, respected, desired. to be visibly refused by a young woman of no great fortune, no exceptional beauty, and no powerful family, a young woman who, by every conventional measure, ought to have been grateful, was not merely unpleasant. It was humiliating. It gave people something to whisper about. And Gerald Stern was not a man who absorbed humiliation quietly or privately. He was a man who absorbed nothing at all without interest. 3 weeks after Lucinda's final and definitive refusal, delivered as privately as she could manage at Lady Ashby's musical evening, when he had cornered her in the anteroom and said something that she would only ever describe to herself as profoundly improper, and she had looked at him very steadily and said no, once with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. 3 weeks after that, Lucinda was walking along Oxford Street with her maid in the mid-morning brightness, when something splashed across the left side of her face and neck. Her maid screamed. Lucinda did not. She remembered the sensation in the order it came. First the impact, then the heat, then the moment before the pain arrived where the world seemed to hold its breath, and then the pain itself, enormous and blinding and total, flooding every sense she had. And the sound she made then was one she spent the following years trying to forget. What had splashed across her face was a weak solution of vitriol, acid, thrown by a man she did not recognize, who vanished into the Oxford Street crowds with the ease of someone who had planned the exit carefully and who was never publicly identified. The damage to the left side of her face and neck healed eventually into a pattern of silvery scars that ran from her jaw to her temple, that gathered more thickly at the collar, that would be visible for the rest of her life in any light that was stronger than candlelight, serious enough to make people look away, not serious enough to prevent her from functioning in a world that would never let her forget it. She had never told anyone who she believed had arranged it, because she was 18 years old and alone and newly injured, and what in God's name would she have said? A young woman, newly scarred, no family connections of consequence, accusing a Viscount's son of arranging an attack on Oxford Street, with no witness to his name, no proof, nothing but the cold certainty in her bones, and 2 words the hired man had spoken before the splash, quiet enough that only she had heard. With compliments. So she had borne it. She had returned to her father's house, and she had recovered through a winter of pain and laudanum, and the careful ministrations of a surgeon who was kinder than most and less capable than he appeared. She had learned what the scarring would look like when it healed. She had sat with that knowledge for several weeks, alone, in a room with no mirror, and she had made a set of decisions that she thought of afterward as the decisions of a woman who intends to survive. She would return to society. She would not hide. She would not explain or apologize or offer any of the tearful, self-deprecating performances that might have generated sympathy, but would have required her to be permanently diminished in exchange. She would dress with care and hold her chin up and respond to cruelty with perfect composure, and she would do this every season for as long as was required, and she would not break. She had managed it for 9 years. The first season after the attack had been the worst, the initial adjustment of society to the new fact of her, the recalibration, the conversations she was no longer included in, the suitors who had shown tentative interest before the incident, who had subsequently found, with remarkable unanimity, reasons to redirect their attentions elsewhere. She had attended that season with her father at her elbow, and she had danced exactly twice, with an elderly general who seemed not to notice her face, or perhaps simply not to care. And she had come home each evening and sat in her chair by the fire and refused, with the stubbornness that would prove to be her most valuable quality, to be destroyed by it. The second season had been different. Not better, never precisely better, but different. Society had finished its initial adjustment and settled into its permanent arrangement with her, present but invisible, attended but unattended to. She had found Nora Fitch in the 3rd season, at a concert she had attended alone while her father stayed home with a cold, and they had discovered over 2 consecutive evenings of music that they thought about most things the same way, which was sufficiently extraordinary that they had subsequently arranged to think about things the same way every Tuesday morning over tea. Gerald Stern, in those years, had married a wealthy young woman from Derbyshire and proceeded through society as though nothing had happened, because from his perspective, nothing had. He had arranged a consequence for a woman who had the temerity to say no to him, and the consequence had worked precisely as intended, and she had had nothing to say about it because she had nothing to say with. He had watched her from across ballrooms, occasionally, not with guilt, she had come to understand, but with the specific satisfaction of a man confirming that the machinery of his power still operated correctly. She had carried the knowledge of who he was through 9 seasons. She had carried it the way a person carries a stone they have been handed and cannot put down, not crushing but constant, a weight that modified everything around it, until the Castleton ball, until the fan snapped open and Lady Drummond's voice carried, and Lucinda reached for her shawl, and everything she had spent 9 years enduring arrived at its final point. She was done. And then the voice. "Miss Vane." She turned. "Miss Vane." She turned. The man standing before her was tall, unusually so, with the kind of physical presence that does not announce itself and does not require announcement. He wore black, almost entirely, which was unfashionable enough to be a statement he seemed completely indifferent to making. His face was lean and angular, with the particular quality of a man who had spent time in places that were neither comfortable nor kind. There was a faint scar at the line of his jaw, she noticed, which had long healed but had left a trace, and his eyes were the grey of a winter sea in the hour before a storm. Not cold, not blank, but watchful in a way that suggested he found the world interesting in ways the world did not realize it was being found. There was, Lucinda would think later, nothing performed about him. No social deployment of his appearance, no studied indifference, no calculated nonchalance. He was simply present in the room in the way that very few people manage to be, fully, specifically, with all of his attention directed at exactly one thing. That one thing was her. Not at the left side of her face with the careful, trained aversion she had learned to recognize in the first fraction of a second of every new introduction. The flicker down, the recalibration, the polite redirecting of the gaze to somewhere just past her shoulder. Not through her, as if she were a window into the more interesting room beyond. At her face. All of it. With an expression of complete and settled attention that contained nothing she could identify as performance. He held no drink. He made no apologetic gesture. She knew who he was. Everyone in that ballroom knew who he was. Rhys Calloway, Duke of Silverton, 34 years of age, veteran of the Peninsula Campaign, where he had served with a distinction the War Office had found awkward to publicize without also publicizing the nature of the service. Former operative for Crown Intelligence, or so the rumours said, and the rumours about Rhys Calloway were generally considered considerably more reliable than most people's sworn testimony, because the rumours about Rhys Calloway had an unusual habit of turning out to be understatements. His estate in Wiltshire was among the finest in England. His fortune was of the order that made other great fortunes feel apologetic about themselves. He had served in Parliament briefly, and his resignation from it had prompted a discomfort in certain quarters that was still not entirely resolved. He was unmarried, which society had been treating as a renewable catastrophe for 3 seasons, and which he had, from all available evidence, treated as a matter of profound indifference. He extended his hand. "I would be grateful," he said, and his voice was low and entirely steady, If you would dance with me, Miss Vane. She looked at the hand. She looked at his face. Across the room, she was distantly aware that Lady Drummond's fan had gone entirely still. She was aware that several conversations had been suspended. She was aware that the room was watching this and would be discussing it before the evening was out, and would make of it whatever it chose to make. She looked at Rhys Calloway and said, because 9 years had made her too tired and too honest for deflection, "Why?" Something moved in those grey eyes. Not irritation, not surprise, something closer to recognition. "Because," he said quite simply, "you were about to leave, and I would prefer that you stayed." She studied him for a long moment. She had discovered over 9 seasons, quite good at reading a room, at identifying the textures of different social motivations, at catching the particular quality of a wager dressed as courtesy, of condescension performing as kindness. She looked for those things now. She did not find them. "I do not dance," she said, because it was true and because it was simpler than everything else. "Not any more, but I thank you, Your Grace." She turned away. She walked to the door, and she waited, braced against her own body's awareness of the room behind her, for the reaction, the stiff withdrawal, the studied indifference deployed for the benefit of onlookers, the performance of not caring that such men always gave when things did not go as planned. He let her go. No performance, no recalibration. He simply let her go. And the absence of what she expected was, she discovered on the carriage ride home, impossible to stop thinking about. She found him waiting in the garden before she had quite reached the door. He had taken the long way through the side passage, she realized, which meant he had moved quickly and known the house. He stood in the shadows of the Castleton garden with the casual authority of a man entirely at ease with unannounced presences in other people's gardens, and he said, "Forgive me. I should have asked to speak with you privately rather than approaching you in the ballroom where half of society was watching." "You ought to have asked at all before following me outside." "Yes." He accepted this without any visible discomfort. "You're right. I apologize." He looked at her steadily. "But I would ask you to hear what I have to say before you return inside. 5 minutes, no more." She looked at him in the garden light, the sounds of the ball muffled behind the glass doors, and she said, "You have 5 minutes." He spoke for 4 of them. First, he needed a wife. This was not, he explained, a romantic declaration. It was a matter of political necessity. There were significant votes before Parliament, and certain men whose support he required were considerably more willing to extend it to a man with a settled household and a respectable duchess. He was a practical man. He was proposing a practical arrangement. "I see," Lucinda said. Second, he had been watching her. He said this without embarrassment and without dramatic staging, which was the most unsettling possible manner of saying it. 3 seasons ago, at a concert at the Hanover Square Rooms, he had seen a woman arrive at a seat beside an empty chair. Another woman had come to claim that empty chair, looked at the scarred face beside it, and silently taken a different seat. And the woman who remained had not changed expression at all, had simply turned back to the music and listened as though nothing had happened. "That kind of endurance," he said, "is not a small thing." Lucinda said nothing. Third, he knew about Gerald Stern. She stopped breathing. The garden was very quiet. Somewhere inside, a violin reached a high note and held it. "I know what he did," Rhys Calloway said. "I know the name of the man on Oxford Street. I know who engaged his services and what was paid. I have known for approximately 2 years, and I have spent that time gathering the documentation that would make the knowledge useful." He paused. None of the women he targeted were in a position to speak against him at the time. I am in a rather different position. She turned away from him. She looked at the dark garden. She breathed very carefully and very deliberately through her nose. "How?" she finally said. "A longer story. What matters now is this." His voice was very even. "I have been patient because patience was necessary. But I find myself no longer willing to be patient while he moves freely through every room that you have to endure, while you—" He stopped himself. When he continued, his voice was more controlled. "While you stand in ballrooms and listen to women like Lady Drummond, perform cruelty for an audience and have no recourse." She turned back to look at him. He was watching her with an expression she had no immediate language for. Not pity. She would have known pity, had become expert at identifying its particular texture in the eyes of people who delivered it with something very close to pleasure. Not discomfort. Not the stiff civility of a man reminding himself of his obligations. Something that looked, with unsettling precision, like anger on her behalf. "What exactly," she said carefully, "are you proposing?" "Marry me," he said. "Give me the domestic arrangement the political situation requires. Give me access to the drawing rooms and dinner tables where certain conversations need to happen. In return, I will destroy Gerald Stern. Publicly. Completely. Permanently. And in the meantime, you will have my name and the protection that comes with it. And no one will speak to you again the way Lady Drummond spoke to you tonight." She looked at him for a long moment. "And if I don't wish to be protected," she said. Something shifted in his expression. She would think about it later. That shift. Try to identify it precisely. The closest she could come was, it looked like recognition. "Then you decline," he said. "The choice is entirely yours." She did not decline. She also did not accept on the spot. She said she needed to consider it and would write to him within the week, and she spent the following days doing exactly what she had promised, turning the proposition over with the same methodical care she brought to everything, examining it from every angle, and having several extremely long conversations with Miss Nora Fitch, who was her only genuine friend in London and who received the news in silence for approximately 20 minutes before becoming extremely useful. Nora Fitch was a vicar's daughter from Lincolnshire, who had come to London 3 years earlier as companion to an elderly countess, and who had stayed after the countess's death because she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she preferred the city to the village. She was 30, sharp-featured, warm-eyed, possessed of a dry humour she deployed sparingly and with precision, and she was the only person alive who knew the complete truth of what had happened on Oxford Street in 1815. "He knows about Stern," Nora repeated slowly. "He says he has documentation." "Do you believe him?" Lucinda thought about the quality of his voice when he said it, the precision of it, the specificity. Not a claim, but a statement. "Yes," she said. "I do." "And the rest of it?" Nora turned her teacup carefully on its saucer. "The being a duchess?" "I am 27 years old," Lucinda said. "I have attended 9 seasons. I made up my mind before the Castleton ball to retire to the country and be done with the whole business entirely." She paused. "This is not what I was expecting." "No." Nora looked at her steadily. "Is it what you want?" Lucinda thought about grey eyes, about a voice that said, "While you endure what you endure with barely controlled restraint," about the way he had looked at her face, all of it, without flinching, without the practiced performance of not seeing. "I don't know yet," she said. She wrote to him on the 4th day. She wrote, "I will accept your arrangement, Your Grace, on the following condition. You will not pity me. You will not soften your manner around me out of a misplaced sense of delicacy about the scars, or about my history, or about anything else. You will speak to me as an equal in all things, and permit me to speak to you in the same way. If you are ever inclined to be tender in a manner that is actually disguised condescension, I will know the difference. And I will leave. He replied the same afternoon. His note was brief. Agreed. On all points, I should mention that I am not a man particularly given to tenderness of any variety, so you are unlikely to have cause to apply the test. But the condition is accepted absolutely. Below that, in the same controlled hand, I should also tell you, the first time I saw you at the Hanover Square Rooms, you were listening to a Mozart adagio with your eyes closed. You looked as though the music was the only thing in the room that you were permitting yourself to feel. I thought about it for 3 years. She read that sentence twice. She folded the letter. She placed it in the drawer where she kept things she intended to keep. They were engaged by the end of the week. Here it is important to pause and consider what an engagement meant in 1824 England, particularly for a woman, because the stakes of the decision Lucinda Vane was making were considerably higher than they might appear on the surface. Under the laws of coverture that governed every married woman in England, the moment she spoke her wedding vows, she would cease to exist as an independent, legal person. Her property would become her husband's property. Any income she might earn would be his income. Contracts she had made before marriage could be dissolved at his discretion. Even her children, in the eyes of English law, belonged to him. A woman choosing a husband in 1824 was not merely choosing a companion. She was signing away her autonomous, legal existence for the duration of her life. There was no mechanism to undo this choice if it proved wrong. There was no divorce available to women of her station. Divorce required a private act of Parliament, cost several £1,000s, and destroyed the woman's reputation regardless of whose fault the marriage's failure had been. To choose badly was to be imprisoned badly. When Lucinda Vane agreed to marry Rhys Calloway, she was doing the most consequential thing a woman of her era could do, under the full knowledge that if she had misjudged him, the law would offer her nothing. The announcement appeared in the Morning Post 3 days later. The reaction of London society was, in several meaningful ways, seismic. Lady Opal Drummond received the news at breakfast in the form of a note from her most reliable source, and she read it twice, and then she set it down very carefully on her bone china plate, and she did not move for a full minute. She had, for 2 seasons, directed her considerable resources toward Rhys Calloway. She had engineered introductions. She had deployed the beauty and the wit and the connections and the precisely calculated appearance of indifference. She had done everything correctly, and she had received from him nothing at all. A brief exchange, a polite withdrawal, and not even the courtesy of a visible rejection that she might have turned into a story about her own choosiness. And now the Morning Post was telling her he had offered for Lucinda Vane. Lucinda Vane with the scarred face and the nothing dowry and 9 seasons of demonstrable failure. Lady Drummond picked up her fan, set it down, picked up her coffee cup, set it down. There was going to be a great deal said about this, and Lady Opal Drummond, who had a gift for saying great deals with surgical efficiency, was going to be the primary mechanism by which those great deals were said. The first time Lucinda appeared in public on the arm of Rhys Calloway was at an evening concert at the Hanover Square Rooms, the same venue where he had first seen her, though she did not know that then, and she had dressed for it with the particular care of a woman who knows she is going to be examined and has decided that she will be examined on her own terms. Ivory silk. A high collar. Not out of concealment, she had decided, but because she liked the line of it. Her hair dressed simply, without the elaborate constructions that fashion currently demanded. No jewels yet. They had not visited the Silverton vault which Rhys had mentioned with the mild tone of a man describing something that would probably surprise her. She took his arm in the entrance hall, and they walked in together. The room did not go silent. That was not precisely how it worked. The music continued, the conversations continued, the glasses continued to be refilled by footmen moving with professional invisibility. And yet there was a quality of attention that spread from their entrance like a stone dropped into still water, a ripple of turned heads and lowered fans and quickly recalculated expressions, and Lucinda felt every single one of them move through the room. She did not look at any of the faces. She had learned not to. She looked ahead. She walked steadily, and beside her, Rhys Calloway moved with the ease of a man who had entered a great many more hostile rooms under considerably worse conditions, and found this one entirely manageable. "Lady Drummond," he said, very quietly, addressing Lucinda without turning his head, his voice pitched for her alone, "is at your 7 o'clock. She has said something to Lord Hereford that made him look at us. He is smiling." "What kind of smile?" "The entertained kind. The kind that suggests he disapproves of whatever she said." Lucinda considered this. Lord Hereford has a granddaughter, Sophia, 17, presented last season. She was excluded from Almack's by an arrangement someone made. She hasn't attended a ball since. A pause. "Was that arrangement made by Lady Drummond?" "I believe so. Yes." "Good to know," he said. His voice was very flat, completely attentive. They found their seats. The music began. And Lucinda Vane, who had sat beside empty chairs for 9 seasons, sat beside a man who, she was slowly and carefully beginning to understand, had no intention of being elsewhere. The weeks that followed were unlike anything she had prepared herself for. She had expected the arrangement to feel like what it was, a transaction. She had built a careful set of expectations, polite distance, comfortable civility, the business-like courtesy of two people who had agreed on mutually beneficial terms. And she had been genuinely relieved by those expectations because warmth was something she had long since decided was not available to her, and she had organized herself around its absence so thoroughly that she was no longer sure she could recognize it if it arrived. What she had not expected was the dinner in the 2nd week of June, when the footman served the soup and withdrew and left them alone at either end of the long dining table. Too long, she had thought, for two people who barely knew each other. Absurd in the candlelight. And she had said, because she had run out of patience with the distance, "This table is ridiculous." He had looked up from his soup. "I inherited it," he said. "It seats 40. "It does." "Why?" "Presumably my grandfather entertained on a scale I have not replicated." He looked at the table. "I have never found it ridiculous before. Possibly because I have never dined with someone who said so." She had moved her place setting on impulse, picked up the plate and the glass and the cutlery, and relocated herself to the seat immediately to his left, 3 feet away instead of 30. He had watched this with an expression she was learning was his version of startled, which looked, from the outside, remarkably like a man who has just seen something he was not expecting and is not displeased by it. "There," she said. "Yes," he said. They ate. And then, because the distance had closed and the room was quiet and the candles were burning low, they talked. Not about the arrangement, not about Sterne or Parliament or the Silverton estate. They talked about the things people talk about when they are in the process of discovering each other's interiors, what she had read recently and what he thought about it, what he had found interesting in the week's newspapers, and what her opinion was of it. She had grown up making sharp observations and keeping them inside her own head, and it turned out, that making them out loud to a man who responded with equal sharpness was something she had been hungrier for than she had known. He told her, over the cheese course, about the Peninsular Campaign. Not a great deal. It was not, she understood, a place he visited easily, but a small thing, offered with the careful precision of someone presenting a piece of themselves in full knowledge that it might be declined. "I was 26 when I went," he said. "I thought I understood what it was. I did not. None of us did. You cannot." He looked at his glass. "When I came back, I found I had very limited tolerance for performances, for people performing things they didn't feel. I found London," a pause, "very loud, in the ways that don't produce any sound." She looked at him in the candlelight. "Is that why you left? For the intelligence work?" "Partly." He looked at her. "Also because it turned out I was rather better at it than I was at being a duke in a drawing room. The ghost of—" Something crossed his face again. "I am working on the drawing room." "You are doing adequately," she said. "High praise." It was meant sincerely. He looked at her for a moment with the specific expression she had not yet named, the one that was not quite a smile but lived in the same country. "I know," he said. "That is precisely why I valued it." She looked down at her wine glass. She thought, "I am in very serious difficulty, and I made a practical arrangement, and it was supposed to stay a practical arrangement, and it has stopped being one, and I do not know precisely when." She looked up. He was still watching her. "Rhys," she said, his given name, the first time she had used it aloud, a small shift that was actually an enormous one. "What did you mean when you said I was already important to you, in the morning room? What you said about Stern?" He was quiet for a moment. "I meant," he said carefully, "that you were not available to be unimportant to me. That, somewhere between the concert hall 3 years ago and the night at the Castleton ball and every conversation since, you had become—" He stopped. His jaw tightened slightly. "I am not practiced at this." "I know," she said. "Try anyway." He looked at her. The candles were very low. The dining room was very quiet. "Mine," he said, very quietly. Not a command. Something closer to a confession. The word that kept coming, when I thought about Stern, about what he did, that she is mine to protect, that he had no right to touch something that was mine. He paused. "I am aware that this is not a conventional sentiment, and I am aware that you are not mine in any literal sense. You are your own. But that was the word." She looked at him across the candlelight for a long time. "I think," she said finally, "that you should tell me more about the Mozart Adagio." And he did, and the candles burned down to stubs, and the wine was finished, and they sat in the long dining room long past, the hour when respectable people retire, talking, actually talking with all the engagement of two people who have been waiting a long time without knowing what they were waiting for, until the clock struck midnight and she rose, and he rose, and they stood for a moment in the doorway, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything. And then she went upstairs. She lay in the dark for a long time. She thought, "I am in very serious difficulty indeed." He looked up. He said, "Lucinda," with the slight shift in expression that she was beginning to understand was his version of surprise. She could see from across the room that the papers were not correspondence of any personal sort. There were official seals, margin annotations in multiple hands. She had a quick eye, had always had, and the word she caught 3 sheets back was Stern. "Tell me," she said. She crossed the room and sat in the chair opposite, and he looked at her for a moment, measuring, she thought, not her trustworthiness, but his own willingness to be unguarded. And then he told her. Not everything. The operational details, the informant's names, the mechanics of evidence collection were not things he shared in full that night. But the shape of it. A pattern of behavior spanning 12 years, multiple women, multiple incidents, not one act of anger, but a system. A man who had found a means of consequence and used it repeatedly, because there had never been a cost. Lucinda sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she listened, and the candle burned lower between them, and when he finished, she was quiet for a long time. 2 of them died, she said. Yes. And the others, surviving in varying conditions. He looked at her steadily. None of them spoke publicly. The world they lived in made that an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. She thought about 9 years of silence, the particular weight of carrying a truth that no one would have believed or would have used against the bearer of it, the specific loneliness of that. "I should have spoken," she said. "You were 18, unprotected, newly injured. You made the choice that was survivable. I might have—" "Lucinda," he said her name with a particular quality, not silencing, but anchoring, as though it were a hand offered to a person standing on uncertain ground. "You survived. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything." The library was very still. After a moment, she said, "When will you act?" "When the season reaches its peak. The Northcott Ball. The room will be large enough to matter." "I want to be there." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "You will be." She rose to leave, then stopped. She turned back. "The Mozart Adagio," she said. "The one you mentioned in your note, the one at Hanover Square." "Yes?" "I had been to 5 events that day. A breakfast, a morning call, an afternoon visit, and a dinner. Before the concert, I was—" She paused. "I was very tired that day. I remember closing my eyes during the Adagio because I needed somewhere to go where no one was looking at me." He looked at her. "I know," he said quietly. "That was what I saw." She left him there in the lamplight, and she went upstairs, and she lay in the dark, and thought about a man who had watched her seek shelter in a piece of music, and had thought about it for 3 years, and she was extremely occupied with that information for a very long time before she finally slept. Their first quarrel, properly speaking, was about the guard. He had, in the week following the library conversation, arranged for a footman to accompany her whenever she went outside. The footman was presentable. He was also, as she noticed on the second day, not precisely what he appeared. He stood with his back too straight and his eyes moving in the particular pattern of someone trained to assess threat rather than carry parcels. She said nothing on the second day. She said everything on the third. "He is not a footman." "No," Rhys agreed. "You assigned a guard to me without informing me." "I assigned protection to my betrothed, which is—" "Without informing me," she repeated. She looked at him across the breakfast table with an expression that meant, and he was learning to read her expressions, that she had prepared for this conversation and was not going to be redirected. "I understand the reasoning. I am not objecting to the reasoning. I am objecting to the fact that a decision was made about my own person without my knowledge or input." Silence. He set down his coffee cup. "You are entirely right," he said. "I should have told you. I did not, and it was a mistake." She had prepared for argument. She had been ready for the patient explanation, the gentle condescension that dressed itself as reason. She was not prepared for, "You are right. It was a mistake. It will not happen again." "Yes," she said. "It was. It will not happen again." She looked at him for a moment. Then she reached across the table and offered him the toast rack, because his was empty, and he took a piece, and they resumed breakfast, and she thought with a curious sensation, "I did not know such a conversation was possible." The scars had not been something she thought much about, in abstract. She had thought about them every day for 9 years in every practical, social, tactical sense. What to wear, how to stand, which angle, which light. But she had not thought about what it would mean to be in close daily proximity to a man who would see them plainly, repeatedly, without the social architecture she had constructed over 9 years to manage other people's looking. The first time he saw them fully, it happened without strategy or preparation. She had been reading in the morning room, the early sun, very bright, through the windows, and she had pushed her collar aside absently, thinking about the page, not the world, and he had come in and stopped, and she had looked up and seen him seeing them, and she had reached for her collar. "Don't," he said. She went very still. He crossed the room. He sat beside her, not across, but beside, in the close proximity of people who have moved past the distances convention maintains. And he looked at her face in the clear morning light. The full extent of the scars, the silvery spread from jaw to temple, the gathering at the collar, the way the texture of the skin changed at the worst of it. She had braced herself. She had a lifetime of practice at bracing herself, 9 specific shapes that the discomfort of onlookers took, which she had catalogued and could identify in the first fraction of a second. None of those 9 shapes appeared on his face. His hand rose, slowly, giving her every moment to withdraw, and his fingers came to rest against her left cheek, the pads of them, light against the scarred skin. And she felt the touch move through her with a completeness that had nothing to do with the physical, that was something more fundamental and more frightening than that. He traced the edge of the largest scar, from jaw to temple, slowly. His expression held something she would spend days trying to identify. Grief and fury in a particular combination, and below both of those something raw and entirely unguarded, which she was beginning to understand was extremely rare from him. 9 years, he said. Yes. And no one, she understood the unfinished sentence. No. His thumb moved just slightly against her cheekbone. This is not damage, he said very low. This is the map of what you survived. I have to pause here and tell you something, because I want you to really understand what that moment meant to her. 9 years. 9 years of people looking away, or looking too directly, or performing not looking in a way that was worse than looking. 9 years of high collars and careful angles, and the armor of absolute stillness. 9 years of carrying alone the knowledge of what had been done to her, and why. And then a man sat beside her in a bright room and traced the marks of what she had endured and called them a map. Not a wound, not a flaw, a map. I rewrote that scene 3 times trying to get it right, and I'm not entirely sure I have, because I am not sure words are quite sufficient to it. But I hope you felt it. She had, as has been established, become extremely practiced at not crying. She turned her face away. She pressed her lips together with great firmness. She breathed through her nose and counted silently to 4, and was generally very determined. It was of no use whatsoever. He did not pretend not to notice. He did not give her the polite fiction of looking elsewhere, which was, she would think later, perhaps the most important thing of all. He sat beside her and waited, and after a moment his hand moved from her cheek to her hand, a different touch, steadier. And he held it, and she let him, and the morning room was full of light. "I want you to understand something," he said, when she was steady again. "I am going to do what I promised about Stern, but I want you to know the arrangement we made is not the whole reason I intend to do it, or it stopped being the whole reason some time ago." She looked at him. "Why else?" she said. He met her gaze and held it, and said, "Because he touched something that was already important to me long before he had any business being important at all." The morning room was very quiet. A carriage passed in the street outside. The light shifted through the window. And Lucinda Vane sat with her scarred face and her held hand in the clear May sunshine and thought, "This is not what I was prepared for. This is not what I was prepared for at all." The jealousy trigger came not from Lady Drummond, but from a man Lucinda had not expected, and it arrived with the particular efficiency of things that happen without being planned for. His name was Lord Aubrey Cassel, Viscount Homefield, 30 years old, recently returned from 4 years in India, possessed of a straightforward charm that had nothing predatory in it, and a genuine quality of interest that Lucinda, in the first 5 minutes of their introduction at Lady Farwell's garden party, found she could not immediately identify as performance. He had approached her while Rhys was speaking with Lord Hereford across the garden. He had bowed correctly and introduced himself correctly and said, "I have been told that you are the most interesting woman in this party, and that the person who told me so was entirely right," with the easy confidence of a man who has spent 4 years in a place where English social rules did not apply and has come back slightly refreshed by their absence. She had looked at him. "Who told you that?" "Miss Fitch. She said," and I quote exactly, "that you were the only person here worth talking to, and that if I had any sense I would stop wasting my time on the West Lawn." He smiled. It was a genuine smile, undeployed, not aimed at anything. She appeared to have strong opinions about the West Lawn. "She does," Lucinda said, "about most things." They talked for 20 minutes. It was not remarkable, not the razor-sharp engagement of her conversations with Rhys, which always felt like sparring with someone exactly her equal in reach. But it was pleasant and genuine, and she found herself speaking without the usual layer of self-monitoring, without the 9-year habit of making herself small, because Aubrey Cassel was looking at her the way a person looks when they are simply listening. And it was, she realized with a small shock, something she had stopped expecting from strangers. He asked if he might call. She was about to answer. She was, in fact, about to say something kind but conclusive, because whatever Aubrey Cassel was, Rhys Calloway was a fact, and had been a fact for some weeks in a way she found increasingly impossible to regard as merely contractual. When she became aware of a quality of stillness on the south side of the garden that had not been there a moment before, she looked. Rhys was standing at the edge of the rose beds, with a champagne glass he was not drinking from, and he was looking at Lord Cassel with an expression that was not, technically, any of the 9 shapes she had catalogued over 9 years of social endurance. It was new. It was the expression of a man who is applying very considerable restraint to something that does not wish to be restrained, and is doing so successfully, but only barely, and only because the alternative would be inadvisable in a garden full of witnesses. Lord Cassel, who was facing Lucinda and therefore could not see Rhys, said again, pleasantly, "Miss Vane, if I might call—" "She is engaged to be married." Rhys had crossed the garden without Lucinda noticing him move. He stood now at her shoulder, not between her and Cassel, not physically displacing anyone, simply present with the absolute completeness of a man who has decided to be in a particular place and intends to stay there. His voice had been perfectly civil. His expression, as he met Cassel's gaze, was perfectly civil. Everything beneath the civility was not. Lord Cassel looked at him. He was not a stupid man. 4 years in India had given him, among other things, a reliable instinct for situations that were more complex than they appeared. He looked at the Duke of Silverton and made a rapid and accurate assessment. "Your Grace," he said, "I was not aware. Forgive me. Miss Vane, congratulations." He bowed, with genuine grace, and withdrew. Entirely, without any of the territorial posturing that another man in his position might have felt entitled to. Lucinda watched him go. Then she turned to look at Rhys. He was watching Castle cross the garden with the particular expression of a man watching a situation resolve itself in an acceptable manner. "He was perfectly civil," she said. "Yes." "He did nothing wrong." "No?" A pause. "No, he didn't." "You," she said, "were extremely present," he said. "I was present." She looked at him. "Is that what we are calling it?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite the almost smile, something rawer than that. "I found," he said, very quietly, "that I had a strong preference for being present." She held his gaze for a moment. Something moved through her that she had no immediate language for, something warm and specific and slightly terrifying, the sensation of a feeling that has been growing in a contained space and has just discovered the container is not quite large enough anymore. "The roses near the south wall," she said. "I believe there is something remarkable happening with the climbing varieties." He offered his arm. She took it, and they walked away from the west lawn. And Nora, Fitch, and the ghost of Lord Castle's civil retreat, and when they reached the roses, Rhys stood close beside her, closer than courtesy required, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm through both their sleeves. And he looked at the climbing roses, and she looked at the climbing roses, and neither of them spoke for quite some time. It was, she thought, a very eloquent silence. Later, at the same garden party, Lady Opal Drummond approached from the east lawn with the practiced elegance of a woman deploying resources she has spent years perfecting. She aimed at Rhys, smiled calibrated smiles, delivered calibrated conversation, and then looked at Lucinda with the warmth of early February and said, "You must find all of this quite extraordinary, Miss Vane, after so many years of—" A pause. A sweep of the fan. "Well." She left the well suspended in the air. Rhys turned to her. "Lady Drummond," he said, "I should mention that I know Lord Hereford's granddaughter, Sophia, 17 years old. She has not attended a ball since the Almack's exclusion last season. I have been meaning to look into how that exclusion came about. Wouldn't you agree that such arrangements, properly examined, make for uncomfortable reading?" Lady Drummond's smile developed a quality of fixity. "Whatever is found," he continued pleasantly, "might find its way into my conversation with Lord Hereford, who is something of a stickler for accountability. Don't you think?" "Of course," Lady Drummond said, extremely correctly. "Wonderful." He turned away from her with the completeness of a door swinging closed. "Shall we find Nora?" he said to Lucinda. "Yes," she said. And Nora, on the garden bench with her teacup, permitted herself one small, deeply satisfied sip as they came toward her, and looked at Lucinda with an expression that said everything she was far too wise to say aloud. She told no one about the notes. They had begun arriving at the end of May. Anonymous, slid beneath the door of her writing room, or placed among her correspondence by hands she never identified. They were brief, unspecific, the kind of communication designed to make someone afraid without giving them anything concrete to address. "You should reconsider. There are things that can be said. You will regret this arrangement." She had put them in the bottom of her writing box and said nothing. She told herself this was rational, that she was not afraid, that she had been managing Stern's shadow for 9 years and would not now surrender to a few pieces of paper. She told herself this was not in any way the old habit of silence. She was aware that she was lying to herself. But the lie had a particular flavor she recognized, the flavor of a woman who has spent 9 years asking nothing of anyone and finds that asking has become a thing she no longer knows how to do. Stern came to the house in the second week of June. She was alone in the small, writing room off the east corridor. Rhys was meeting with his solicitor. The footman, who was not a footman, had been sent on an errand she suspected now had been deliberately arranged, when the door opened without a knock, and Gerald Stern walked in. 41 years old now, softening around the jaw. Something in his eyes that had not been there at 30. The specific look of a man who has built his life on getting away with things and has begun to sense, somewhere in the lower registers of himself, that the reckoning is closer than he planned for. He closed the door behind him. She set down her pen. "You should end the engagement," he said. "I beg your pardon." "End it. Tell him you've changed your mind. The settlement hasn't been printed. You can still—" "Lord Stern," she said, and she was somewhat surprised to hear how steady her voice was, given that her hands were less steady than she preferred. "You are in my betrothed's house without an invitation, in a room with me unaccompanied, and you are making a demand. I would invite you to reconsider your position." His jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're involving yourself in. Calloway thinks he has something on me. He doesn't have what he thinks." "I believe," she said, "that you should leave. If you don't end this engagement, there are things about you I can make known. Things about what really happened on Oxford Street, about who was asking for it." "I would," said a voice from the doorway, "strongly recommend that you do not finish that sentence." Rhys Calloway stood in the doorway with the still absolute quality of a man who has arrived exactly where he intended and is entirely undisturbed by what he has found. His eyes moved from Stern to Lucinda, checking, she understood, not for injury, but for the specific kind of distress that had no visible mark. And then back to Stern, and the look that settled on Gerald Stern's face at the sight of those grey eyes was something that Lucinda, who had endured 9 years of that man's shadow, found deeply satisfying. "Get out of my house," Rhys said, "and understand clearly I will not make this request a second time." Stern left. Quickly. The door closed behind him, and Rhys crossed to her, and he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she paused. "You were outside the door?" "I was." "For how long?" "Long enough." His jaw was very tight. "He came alone. That was careless. He is frightened." "More frightened than I expected," she said slowly, "which means the end is closer than I had timed it for." He looked at her with the specific expression she had learned to associate with his processing of something important. "Are you certain you're all right?" She almost said yes again. Then she remembered the notes in the bottom of the writing box. She took them out and gave them to him without speaking. He read them. He read them with an expression that did not change, but that had a quality of stillness about it that she was learning, had been learning since the morning in the library, since the breakfast table argument, since the morning room was not the same as calm. "How long?" he said. 3 weeks. He looked at her. She looked back. And she did not apologize, because she had decided she would not apologize, but she did say, "I have been carrying things alone for a long time. The habit is, it is a difficult habit to break." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes," he said, "I know what that is." He looked at the notes again. He folded them carefully and placed them in his coat. "After the Northcote ball," he said, "he will not be able to do this to anyone else." "I know," she said. "I want you to know something." He looked at her, and the expression was the unguarded one, the one that did not have the usual management applied to it. "You should not have been carrying this alone. You should not have been carrying any of it alone for 9 years, and the fact that you did and are still standing is—" He stopped. When he continued, his voice was very deliberate. "I am glad you are still standing." She held that for a moment. "I find," she said quietly, "that I am also glad." The separation came in the 3rd week of June, and it came, as separations so often do, from a half-heard truth misread through the lens of 9 years of disappointment. She was passing the library, the door half open, which was unusual, she would note afterward, when she heard voices. Rhys's voice, and Lord Barton Fell's voice, and a sentence that stopped her in the corridor as surely as a physical barrier. "You cannot continue pretending the original reasons are still the only relevant ones," Fell was saying. "I am not pretending anything," Rhys said. "She was chosen for practical reasons, the political situation, the social requirements. Barton, I only mean—" "Stop," Rhys said. One word, very quiet, a pause. "You have feelings for her," Fell said, not unkindly. Silence. Lucinda stood in the corridor and heard the original reasons. Practical. She did not hear the silence that followed, or the quality of it. She did not hear what was contained in the moment before Rhys spoke again, or what he might have said if she had remained. She heard what 9 years had trained her to hear, the confirmation of what she had always feared, beneath every warming thing she had allowed herself to feel in the past 6 weeks, that this was a transaction, and she had been a fool to feel it as anything more. She left for Nora's house that afternoon. She sent a note that said only, "I need several days." She did not cry in the carriage. She considered this, given the circumstances, an incomplete victory. She cried quite comprehensively once she reached Nora's modest rooms on Marylebone Lane, and Nora received this without comment, with tea, and with the particular steadiness of a person who understands that some things must simply be waited through. "What did he say?" Nora asked, much later when the tea had gone cold and the afternoon light had shifted to evening gold. Lucinda told her. Nora listened with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. Then she said, very quietly, "What did he say after?" "I didn't stay." A silence. "Lucinda." "I know," Lucinda said. "I know." She did know. She knew in the rational part of her mind that had always been reliable, that she had heard half a sentence and built a verdict from it. She had done precisely the thing she had accused the whole of society of doing to her face, looked at a fragment, filled in the rest from assumption, and walked away before the truth could complicate the story she had already decided on. She knew this. It did not help particularly. 9 years of disappointment is not undone by knowing. It runs deeper than knowing. It lives in the body, in the reflexes, in the particular flinch that happens before the mind has time to intervene. She stayed at Nora's. The first day was the worst. She sat in Nora's small sitting room and looked out of the window at Marylebone Lane and waited, in spite of everything, to hear a carriage. He was a duke. He had resources. If he wanted to explain himself, he could find her in under an hour. No carriage came. She told herself this confirmed it. She told herself the silence meant exactly what she had always suspected, that she had let herself be fooled by proximity and gratitude into mistaking management for feeling, and that the fact of his not coming was simply the fact of his not needing to. She had misunderstood the terms. She had allowed herself to need something she had not been offered. This was her error, and she would correct it, and she would be perfectly fine, which she had been before, and would be again. She was not perfectly fine. She sat in Nora's sitting room in the evenings and held her book open at the same page for an hour at a stretch, and did not read it. And Nora made soup and said nothing of any use, and was therefore, of all the people Lucinda had ever known, precisely the right person to be with. The second day was quieter and therefore worse. There was no noise in it, no drama, no argument, nothing to work against. Just the ordinary sounds of Marylebone Lane and Nora's household and the particular quality of an absence she had not known she was carrying until it was gone. She thought about the breakfast table, the library at midnight, the morning room. She thought about his hands on her face and the way he had said the map of what you survived, with the grief in his expression that she now understood, with the horrible clarity of 2 days of separation, had been entirely genuine. She thought, I left before he could answer. She thought, I have been waiting 9 years for someone to confirm what I already believed about myself. And when the confirmation did not come, I constructed it from 14 words and the habit of assuming the worst. She thought, I am an idiot. Nora, on the second evening, said only, he hasn't tried to contact you. No? A pause. That seems, Nora said carefully, like something that might mean more than one thing. He could send a note. He could call. He has my direction. He could, Nora agreed. Or he could be a man who told you that you were not required to reciprocate, and who is, in his particular and deeply aggravating way, doing the same, not requiring anything of you, waiting to see if you come back. Lucinda looked at her. I'm merely speculating, Nora said, and sipped her tea with an expression of extreme innocence. The third morning, Lucinda rose at 7 and looked at her own reflection and said aloud to herself in the small mirror above Nora's washstand, You are a coward, and you have been a coward for 3 days, and it is time to stop. She went downstairs. She found Nora already at the kitchen table with a pot of tea, and an expression that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this. I need, Lucinda said, to go back. Yes, Nora said. I left before he could speak. You did. I have been constructing a verdict from a fragment for 3 days. You have. You could have said any of this on the first day. Nora looked at her with the serenity of someone who has made entirely correct choices. You weren't ready to hear it on the first day. Lucinda put on her coat. She was at the door when she heard it. The sound she had stopped waiting for on the first evening. A carriage, stopping on Marylebone Lane. A door. Footsteps she knew. She had always known his footsteps. A knock. She opened the door herself before Nora could rise. He was standing on the step, alone. No carriage, actually. Which meant he had walked. Which meant he had walked from Mayfair to Marylebone in the early June morning. And he looked at her, and for a moment neither of them said anything. He had not slept well. She could see it in the lines of him. The tiredness that his containment was working harder than usual to manage, the specific quality of 3 days of a man applying considerable discipline to the impulse to come earlier. She understood, looking at him, that he had been waiting, that he had received her note, I need several days, and he had interpreted it correctly as a request for space rather than an invitation to force the conversation, and he had sat with that for 3 days with the same patience he had applied to 3 years of watching from concert hall balconies, and he had come at the first moment he believed he could come, without trespassing on what she had asked for. 3 days. For a man who could have sent a footman in 20 minutes, he had given her 3 days. Lucinda, he said. She stepped back from the door. Come in, she said. I was about to come to you. Something moved through his expression, fast, unguarded, gone before she could fully name it, but she caught the edge of it. Relief. Enormous and very carefully managed. He came in. Nora appeared from the kitchen, looked at both of them, and said with great decisiveness, I have an errand, and left the house, with her basket and her hat, and the particular tact of a woman who has been waiting 3 days to use it. He sat in the chair across from her, without asking permission, consistent with everything she knew of him. And he said, You heard what Barton said. Part of it. You didn't stay for the rest. I heard enough to... Lucinda. Her name in that voice, with that quality, the anchoring quality, the one she had stopped pretending she was immune to. The practical terms were why I began. They are not why I continued. They stopped being why I continued approximately 3 weeks into our arrangement at the breakfast table when you told me you would leave if I failed to meet your standard, with complete composure, as though leaving were simply the available recourse and you were prepared to take it without drama. She waited. I found that I was extremely unwilling for you to leave. He sat in the chair across from her and said, "You heard what Barton said. Part of it. You didn't stay for the rest." "I heard enough to—" Lucinda. Her name, in that voice, with that quality, the anchoring quality. She had been trying to be immune to it. She was not immune to it, and she was no longer sure she wanted to be. The practical terms were why I began. They are not why I continued. They stopped being why I continued approximately 3 weeks into our arrangement at the breakfast table when you looked at me across the tea things and told me that you would leave if I failed to meet the standard you had set for yourself with complete composure, with absolute certainty, as though leaving were simply the available recourse and you were prepared to take it without drama. She stared at him. "I found," he said, "that I was extremely unwilling for you to leave. That is not," he said, with the precision of a man who has been composing this for 24 hours, the feeling of a man managing a practical arrangement. "I know the difference. I have managed practical arrangements. They do not produce this." He pressed his lips together briefly. "You asked me on the terrace at Farwell's what it meant when I said you were already important to me. I gave you an incomplete answer. I would like to give you a more complete one now." She waited. He rose. He crossed to the window of Nora's small sitting room and stood with his back to her for a moment, the only time she had ever seen him stand with his back to anyone, she realized. And then he turned. "When I was in the intelligence service," he said, "I spent 4 years not being able to afford to care about anything, not specifically. Nothing specific, nothing personal, nothing that could be used against you. You learn the management of that very thoroughly. You become—" He paused, very contained. "And then you come back, and the management is still there, and you find that caring specifically about anything is difficult, not impossible. Difficult." She was very still. "I watched you for 3 years," he said, "because you were the first specific thing that penetrated the management, the first thing I found myself thinking about at—" He stopped. "At odd moments. Not in the abstract. Specifically. Your face in a concert hall. The way you held yourself at a ball as though you had every right to be there, which you did, and which society was not acknowledging, and which you refused to surrender despite the fact that no one was confirming it." He looked at her directly. Those grey eyes, which were not cold, had never been cold, she knew now. "I love you," he said. "I have been in love with you for the better part of 3 years, and I have been very disciplined about it, until rather recently, and I am asking you to come home and to allow me to say so, clearly, because I should have said it clearly some time ago, and the fact that I didn't was its own kind of dishonesty, which I find I cannot maintain." The sitting room was very quiet. Nora, below, had apparently given up the pretense of tea-making and was simply standing in the kitchen, in silence. Lucinda looked at him for a long time. She looked at the face she had been learning, the angular lines of it, the scar at the jaw, the specific quality of his attention when it was aimed at her, and she thought about 3 years of a man watching her in concert halls, about the library at midnight, about the morning room and the map and his hands, both of them on her face, about mine, said so quietly it was almost not a word. She rose. She crossed to him. She put her hand against his chest, where she could feel his heart, which was not entirely steady, and she looked up at him and said, "I think you have been very foolish." Something shifted in his expression. "Yes." "You could have said this considerably earlier." "Yes." "I have been in love with you," she said, "since the night in the library when you said you survived and that was enough. And if you had simply said what you just said to me 3 weeks ago, we would have been spared a great deal of unnecessary—" He kissed her. It was not the first time. There had been the terrace the evening prior, when Nora had come to find her and been somewhat expressively silent about what she found. But it was the first time without the specific gravity of the Northcote ball pressing against it, without the enormous backdrop of 9 years coming to an end. It was simply them, in Nora's small sitting room on Marylebone Lane at 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning, with the sounds of the street below and the sun coming through the window at an angle, and it was the most ordinary and most extraordinary thing she had experienced. She stepped back, eventually, and looked up at him, and she said, "We are going home." "Yes," he said, "and you are going to be considerably more forthcoming in future." "Within reason," he said, "unconditionally." The ghost of that almost smile. "Agreed," he said. She took his arm. Below, Nora made a sound that might have been triumph and might have been a kettle finally coming to the boil. It was difficult to distinguish. "Now I need to tell you about what happened at the Pemberton supper the week before the Northcote ball, because it is important that you understand exactly what Gerald Stern was, in full, before you watch what happened to him." He had been making his preparations. She had not known this, had known only about the notes and the visit to the house and the hired man who had tried to stop the carriage on Piccadilly, all of which constituted a pattern. She had identified as the pattern of a frightened man attempting to control a situation that had moved beyond his control. She had not known that he had spent the first week of July conducting a quieter campaign, a whisper here, a suggestion there, the particular kind of socializing that a man does when he is trying to build a consensus before he has to use it. The Pemberton supper was a small affair. 12 guests, Lady Pemberton's intimate circle, the kind of gathering where the conversation was supposed to be free. Lucinda was invited because Lady Pemberton had been one of the early adopters of the Silverton engagement, a woman of 60 who had watched Lucinda survive 9 seasons with the assessor's eye of someone who had survived a few difficult seasons herself, and who had extended her approval of the match in the form of increasingly warm invitations. Rhys was in Surrey that evening, an estate matter unavoidable, and he had asked her to take Nora and send word if anything was needed. She had gone. It was 12 people in a dining room. She had managed far worse. Gerald Stern was the 13th guest. She understood the moment she saw him, placed 4 seats down from her, already present when she arrived, with the specific quality of a man who had arranged to be there and was watching her realize it. She understood what this was. One last attempt. One final deployment of the power he had exercised for 12 years. The power to stand in a room with her and make her feel it. He waited until the fish course. He waited until the conversation had found its comfortable rhythm, until the footman had refilled the glasses and the table had settled into the warm ease of people who have dined together before. He waited until the specific moment when Lady Pemberton was engaged with the gentleman to her left, and the natural flow of table conversation had created a pocket of relative quiet around the middle of the table. Then he said, loudly enough for the 4 people nearest him to hear, "I understand the Duke of Silverton found himself a project this season. Rather, a specific kind of charity, I've always thought, taking on something the market had rejected. One does wonder what a man of his intelligence sees in the exercise. Unless, of course—" He paused as though something had just occurred to him. "Unless it is precisely the damage that appeals." The table went very quiet in the way of tables that have just heard something that cannot be unheard. Lucinda set down her fish fork. She looked at Gerald Stern across the white linen and the crystal and the candlelight, and she looked at him the way she had been looking at things since she was 18 years old, with the absolute composure that 9 years had made into her finest armor, and behind it, with the specific clarity of a woman who has spent 9 years knowing exactly who this man is. "Lord Stern," she said. Her voice was perfectly even. "I have found in the 9 years of your acquaintance that you are most dangerous when you are most frightened. What is it, precisely, that you are frightened of tonight?" The table was silent. Stern's jaw tightened. "You spoke loudly enough to be heard by 4 people," she said. "You chose your moment carefully while my betrothed was absent. You deployed in a room full of Lady Pemberton's friends, a remark designed to suggest that a man of intelligence could only want me out of some disordered impulse." She looked at him with complete steadiness. "I think we are both aware that there is a document in circulation that describes in considerable detail certain events of the summer of 1815. I think we are both aware that the men who hold it are currently deciding the most useful application for it. And I think," she paused, "I think you came to this supper because you are running out of time, and because cruelty is the only language you have ever been fluent in, and because you believed that 9 years of practice at making me feel small had given you a particular purchase on my silence." She held his gaze. "You were mistaken about that 9 years ago. You remain mistaken tonight." Complete silence. Lord Stern looked at her. She looked at him. The candlelight was steady between them. He looked away first. Lady Pemberton, who had heard every word from the head of the table and whose expression had passed through several distinct phases during the exchange, set down her own fork very deliberately. "Lord Stern," she said, in the voice of a woman who has been deciding something, "I find that I owe you an apology. I invited you to my table in error. I shall not do so again." She turned to Lucinda with the calm of a woman who has made up her mind and found it restful. "Miss Vane, I wonder if you might sit closer to me for the remainder of the meal. I have been wanting to ask you about the Silverton estate gardens." Stern left before the dessert course, and Lucinda sat next to Lady Pemberton and talked about gardens and ate her supper and felt, with a clarity that was entirely new, that she had just done something she had not been capable of 9 years ago, or 7 years ago, or even 1 year ago. Not because she was braver, because she was no longer alone, because somewhere in the past weeks, the knowledge that she was not carrying this by herself had done something to the architecture of her silence, had opened a door in it, had let out quietly and permanently the particular air of the trapped. She wrote to Rhys that evening. The note was brief. "Stern came to Pemberton's supper tonight. I handled it. I will tell you everything when you return. I am quite all right. Come home soon." He arrived at 7 the following morning, having left Surrey in the dark. Now I need to tell you about what happened on Piccadilly 2 days later, because the danger was not finished yet. He had been right that Stern's desperation made him careless. A frightened man who has spent 12 years operating on the certainty that the women he targets have neither the resources nor the standing to fight back, does not adapt easily to the discovery that he was wrong about this, and has always been wrong about this, and that the woman he has most badly underestimated is about to demonstrate it publicly in front of half of London's ruling class. Careless men do careless things. Lucinda was returning from a lending library on Piccadilly, accompanied by her maid Agnes, a Cornish girl of 18, who was fierce and quick and thoroughly loyal. And she had been, she would acknowledge afterward, somewhat overconfident in the protection offered by the afternoon crowds. The footman, who was not a footman, had been sent to collect a parcel from the Silverton solicitor's office. She had thought 2 hours, the main streets entirely manageable. The carriage turned off Piccadilly into a quieter street behind it, a necessary shortcut, the coachman's usual route, and slowed for a dray cart ahead. The door came open. Agnes made a sound. That was not quite a scream. Too trained for that, too controlled, but was in the register of shock. And the man in the doorway was large and entirely purposeful, with the specific quality of someone who has been paid for a job and has decided to complete it. Lucinda had placed the folding knife in her reticule 3 weeks ago at Rhys's suggestion. She had thought, at the time, that it was the kind of precaution a practical person took, and that practically speaking it would never be needed. She had thought about it occasionally in the weeks since, taken it out, looked at it, put it back, with the distant awareness of someone who has an umbrella and has begun to look at the sky. She took it out now. She opened it with the particular calm of a woman who has spent 9 years refusing to be destroyed and has therefore developed a certain relationship with crisis. Not the absence of fear, but the management of it. The same management that had held her face still in ballrooms while fans snapped open, applied now to a different kind of room. "If you reach further into this carriage," she said, "I will use this." He looked at the knife. He looked at her face. He reached. She cut the back of his hand, shallow, deliberate, enough to make a point rather than cause injury. And he recoiled with the specific shock of a man who had not anticipated the woman fighting back, which was, she thought distantly, precisely the problem with men like Gerald Stern. They built entire systems of harm on the assumption that the women in them would not. Agnes, demonstrating the quick thinking of a Cornish girl who has been paying attention, screamed then, properly, loudly, the kind of scream that carries across a street and turns heads. And from behind the stopped carriage came the sound of a second carriage pulling up fast, and a door and footsteps, and then Rhys Calloway came around the side of the carriage at a pace that had nothing social about it whatsoever. What followed was brief. What Rhys said to the man in the doorway, very quietly, very close, with a quality that Lucinda would describe afterward only as specific. She did not hear clearly. She heard the tone of it. She saw the man's face change in the way of someone who has just understood something about the nature of the situation he has placed himself in. She watched him step back, and back further, and then remove himself from the street entirely with the speed of a man who has been given excellent reasons to be somewhere else. Rhys came to the carriage door. He looked at her face with the checking expression. Not for blood, she understood now with complete certainty, but for the other thing, the thing that had no visible mark, the specific distress of a woman who has just been reached for in a closed carriage. He looked for it with the attention of a man who has learned, over weeks, all her exact expressions. He did not find it. What he found was Lucinda, with a folding knife open in her right hand, and Agnes pressed against the far seat, and an expression of complete, steady composure. "You're all right," he said. "I told you," she said, "that I was not helpless." He looked at the knife. He looked at her. He looked at the knife again. And the expression on his face, she would carry it with her for the rest of her life. That expression was something she would spend a long time trying to find language for, and the closest she ever got was, it was the face of a man who has been afraid for someone, and is now watching that someone be entirely themselves in the middle of the thing he was afraid of, and is experiencing simultaneously the relief and the recognition and the specific, overpowering quality of being completely in love with a person for reasons that have nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with exactly who they are. He took the knife from her hands with great gentleness, as though she were something important that was also quite sharp. He folded it closed. He placed it in his coat pocket. He took her hand. Agnes, from the far seat, made a small sound of intense satisfaction that she immediately suppressed. "After the Northcott ball," Rhys said, Yes. 2 days. Yes. And then it is done. She looked at him, at the jaw that was very tight, at the eyes that had not been cold from the first evening, and which she now understood contained in their grey depths something extremely specific and entirely hers. And she said, "I know." They sat in the stopped carriage on Piccadilly, with his hand over hers and the afternoon sun coming through the window, and Agnes made herself very quiet in the corner, and Lucinda thought, "I am not afraid. I have not been afraid for a long time. I'm not sure exactly when it left, but it has gone, and what is in its place is something I think I will be spending the rest of my life learning the dimensions of." She was looking forward to it. The Northcote Ball was held on the 2nd of July, and it was, as it was every year, the event by which the success of the entire season was measured. Every family of consequence attended. 1,200 candles in the chandeliers, the room so full of silk and diamonds that the air itself seemed to sparkle, the kind of event that London society built its year around as a point of navigation. Lucinda dressed that evening with a different quality of care from every other evening. Not defensive care, not the careful angles and the management of other people's looking. She put on the gown he had made for her at the Silverton jewellers, deep blue silk, fitted and elegant, with a collar that was high enough to suit her taste, and low enough that the scars at the base of her throat were visible in the candlelight. And she sat at her mirror and looked at her own face, full on, for the first time in 9 years, without the reflexive flinch, the left side, the jaw, the temple, the silvery spread of it in the lamplight. She looked for a long time. She thought about what he had said in the morning room, the map. She thought about his hands on her face, both of them, without hesitation, and the way he had looked at her with that expression, the unguarded one. She picked up the single strand of pearls he had left on her dressing table that morning, with a note that said only, "These were my mother's. I would like you to wear them tonight." She put them on. She rose. She went downstairs. Rhys was waiting in the hall in black, always in black, and he looked at her, the way he looked at her, which was the way she had stopped trying to be indifferent to some weeks ago, and he said, "The pearls suit you." "They do," she agreed. Then, "Are you ready?" "Always," he said. "Are you?" She considered the question with genuine seriousness. 9 years, every ball, every season, every fan and every whisper and every carefully deployed performance of not seeing. Gerald Stern moving through rooms untouched while she carried the weight of what he had done in absolute silence, the whole architecture of her 9-year endurance. "Yes," she said, "more than ready." And they went. It began not with shouting but with quiet, because Rhys Calloway had always understood that the most effective destructions are not loud. Lord Barton Fell approached Gerald Stern near the card-room entrance at 10:30 with a document and a low voice. Lucinda watched from across the ballroom, from the far side, on Rhys's arm, and he was very still beside her with the stillness that meant he was watching everything. She watched Stern's face move through confusion, then dismissal, then the first real understanding that the ground had shifted beneath him in a manner that could not be recovered from. Lord Hereford moved toward them from the direction of the supper-room. 70 years old, the authority of a man whose reputation for fairness had been maintained across half a century. He did not hurry. He did not need to. A third man joined them, Lord Ashby, whose connections to the magistrate's office were matters of public knowledge, and a fourth, the elderly Lord Pemberton, whose presence at any gathering constituted an implicit endorsement of the business being assembled. What followed was not theatrical. I need to stop here and tell you this, Because in stories like this, we sometimes imagine justice as a great storm, a thunderclap, a dramatic confrontation, a villain backing away in cinematic shame. What actually happened was far more devastating than that. The four men presented their evidence quietly. They used correct voices. They did not raise anything. Gerald Stern denied the contents of the document, and they waited for his denial to finish. And then they continued. He argued. They waited for that to finish as well. The written testimony of the man who had stood on Oxford Street 9 years ago was read, aloud, briefly, specifically, in the measured voice of Lord Hereford, who had spent 20 years as a justice of the peace before inheriting his title and knew what an account that would hold looked like. Stern's face went through several changes during the reading that Lucinda watched from across the room as though watching through water, detached, dreamlike, with the quality of a thing experienced after long waiting. She was not aware of Rhys's hand covering hers until he moved his thumb, the barest pressure, and she looked up at him. He was watching Stern. His jaw was very tight, but he felt her look and glanced down, and his eyes found hers in the candlelight, and something passed between them that she would have no adequate words for until much later, something that was simpler than everything they had said to each other, which was, "I see you. I am here. It is almost over. 9 years. It is almost over." She looked back across the room. The men around Stern stepped away. They did not raise their voices. They did not make any gesture toward the larger room. They simply withdrew. Their attention moved elsewhere, as though Gerald Stern had ceased to constitute anything worth the application of thought, and the withdrawal of attention from powerful men in a room full of powerful observers was its own form of verdict, one more final and more complete than any raised voice or public accusation could have been. Lord Hereford turned to the room once. Just once. He said nothing. He did not need to. The room understood. Within 20 minutes, 3 lords had found reasons to be elsewhere than Stern's vicinity. Within the hour, the first whispers had crossed the ballroom. Lucinda caught fragments of them, altered and growing and moving toward the shape of the truth, which was always how such things moved in rooms like this. By morning, the story would have a form. Within the fortnight, the official proceedings Rhys had set in motion with the magistrate's office would constitute a second, undeniable layer of reality. Gerald Stern left the Northcote ball at 11 o'clock. He walked through those doors, past the footmen, past the arriving carriages, past the broad, lit entrance of the house where 1,200 candles still burned, and out of that world, and out of the life he had constructed on 9 years of Lucinda Vane's silence. And he did not come back. Lucinda stood in the Northcote ballroom and watched him go. She felt, and this is what she would tell Nora the following morning, when Nora asked how it felt, not triumph, not the hot satisfaction she had sometimes imagined in the dark years when she had permitted herself to imagine. She felt something quieter, the specific sensation of a door that has been open for 9 years, clicking shut, the cessation of a draught she had been living around for so long that she had stopped calling it a draught and started calling it the air. She exhaled. Lady Opal Drummond departed 20 minutes later with the expression of a woman recalculating quickly and not yet arriving at satisfactory numbers. Lucinda watched her go as well and felt even less. Nothing, really, except perhaps the faintest shadow of the young woman who had once stood on the far side of a ballroom and heard a fan snap open and thought, enough. That person deserved more than enough. She had got considerably more than enough. She slipped out to the terrace through the glass doors because she needed 10 minutes. Just 10 minutes of cool, dark air and stars overhead, and the sound of the music coming muffled from inside, stripped of its social weight, just music. She stood at the stone balustrade with her hands on the cold limestone and looked up at the clear July sky and breathed. The night was very large. The kind of night that makes everything that happened inside feel appropriately small and appropriately enormous at the same time. Behind the glass doors, London went on being London. The clink of glasses, the sweep of a violin in the last bar of the waltz, voices rising and falling in the particular cadence of a gathering that has just had something significant happen and is in the early stages of understanding what it means. She breathed. She thought about 9 years. Not with grief. Grief was not what she felt, standing on that terrace with the July sky above her and the roses below and the sound of the music. She thought about the shape of them. 9 years of arriving and enduring and returning home and rising the following morning and continuing. 9 years of high collars and careful angles and the armor of absolute stillness. 9 years of a truth she had carried in her bones and never been in a position to put down. And now it was done. She heard his footsteps. She had always been able to identify his footsteps, had learned them weeks ago, filed them quietly in her body's knowledge of the world, alongside the particular quality of his voice, when he was processing something important, and the way the room felt when he entered it, and the expression he wore in unguarded moments when he thought she was not looking, and she was always looking. She was no longer embarrassed by what any of that said. She had made her peace with what it said. She heard him come to stand beside her. She heard him look at the sky with her, and for a moment neither of them spoke, just stood together in the July dark with the stars overhead and the music inside and 9 years behind them and everything else ahead. "It's done," she said. "Yes." She exhaled, a breath that seemed to have been held for 9 years, or something close to 9 years, or some long portion of 9 years that had been too long regardless of its exact duration. And the July night received it, and was unchanged by it, and continued to be the July night, which was, she thought, exactly what was needed. I need to pause here, because I want you to feel this moment with me. 9 years, 9 seasons of sitting beside empty chairs and watching fans snap open and carrying alone the knowledge of what had been done to her, and why. And now, on a terrace in July with the sound of a waltz drifting through glass doors, it was over. All of it. Not with a roar, but with the quietness that justice almost always has when it finally arrives. Not a storm, but a door clicking shut. I think about Lucinda Vane standing on that terrace and breathing that first full breath, and I find I cannot quite improve on what she must have felt. I think you know what she felt. I think some of you have waited a long time for a breath like that yourselves. "Lucinda," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in the morning room, the unguarded one, the one that did not have the management applied to it, and he said, "I want to say something." "Then say it." "I love you." He said it with the particular directness that was his way, with everything he considered important. No prelude, no softening. The same voice he used for facts he considered established and was presenting for acknowledgement. This was not part of the arrangement we made. I am aware that it was not. I have no expectation that you... He stopped himself. His jaw tightened slightly. "I simply want you to know it. You are not required to reciprocate." I have to pause here one more time because I need you to hear what he just said. A man who spent 34 years building walls around everything that could be used against him stood on a terrace in July and told a woman he loves her, and in the same breath, the exact same breath, told her she was not required to say it back. He said, "I love you, and you owe me nothing for it." Do you understand what it costs a person like that to say something like that? I wrote that line, and I had to sit with it for a while before I could continue. I think it is the most honest thing he says in the entire story. And I think the audience will have already known it for pages before he said it. I knew it from the concert hall. She stared at him. He had the expression of a man who has said something significant and is currently in the early, unsteady seconds of having said it, before the response comes, before the landscape is known. And he was holding himself very still in the manner of a man who has decided to be patient about whatever follows. "Rhys," she said. "Yes." "In what world do you imagine I don't love you back?" He went very still. "What?" he said, very quietly. "The morning in the library," she said, "3 weeks ago at Farwell's, when you looked at Lady Drummond and I watched you construct her ruin in 3 sentences without raising your voice. The breakfast table, the morning room." She looked at him steadily. "The day you traced my scars and told me they were a map." He was looking at her. "I have been," she said, "extraordinarily occupied with you for a considerable number of weeks. I assumed you were aware of this." "I was not," he said, certain. "You were wrong to be uncertain." He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps, and then his hands were on her face, both of them, the left against the scarred side, without hesitation, as it always was, without the practiced performance of not noticing, without anything but the specific attention he gave everything that was specifically important. And he looked at her for a moment, all of her, in the July starlight. "May I kiss you?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He kissed her. The music played on inside. The July stars were overhead. His hands cradled her face, both of them, all of it, scars and all, and she kissed him back with everything she had, with 9 years of stored-up wanting and the particular intensity of a woman who has waited a long time for something she had stopped permitting herself to believe was possible, and who is now, with both hands, taking it. The night was warm and enormous, and entirely indifferent to the fact that it was witnessing something irreversible. After a very long time, he rested his forehead against hers. "I watched you," he said, very low, his voice rougher than its usual evenness. "Close your eyes during a Mozart adagio in a concert hall 3 years ago. I thought, I want to know what she is thinking about in there, what it looks like inside her mind." She put her hands against his chest. She could feel his heart, which was not entirely its usual steady pace, and she found that extremely satisfying. "It looks," she said, "somewhat like this." He made a small sound that was, she was almost certain, a laugh, the real kind, brief and startled and completely unperformed, and it was, she thought, the best thing she had heard all evening. Better even than the door closing on Gerald Stern, better than everything. She filed it carefully, the way she had always filed things worth keeping. They were married in September at the church nearest to Silverton Estate in Wiltshire, a stone building that had borne witness to the marriages of Calloways for 200 years and seemed to regard the occasion with the measured approval of architecture that has seen enough of human history to recognize when something important is being settled. It was not a large ceremony. Rhys was not a man who wanted spectacle, and Lucinda was not a woman who had ever been permitted the luxury of wanting it, but it was witnessed by enough of the right people to constitute, in the language of that world, an event of the most definitive kind. Nora Fitch stood beside Lucinda in a gown the colour of autumn leaves, and her expression throughout the ceremony was one of such complete personal satisfaction that Lord Barton Fell, standing at Rhys's elbow, whispered that she appeared to be winning something. "She is," Rhys said. "What?" 9 years of being right about what Lucinda deserved. The church was warm with candles. The vicar had known the Calloway family for 30 years and had therefore already made all necessary adjustments to his expectations for this ceremony. The words he spoke were the words that had been spoken in that church for 200 years. The same words, falling into the same silence, with the same September light coming through the windows. Outside, the Wiltshire countryside was beginning its turn toward autumn, the trees along the churchyard wall showing the first threads of gold. The scar was visible in the church candlelight. Anyone who cared to look could see it clearly. No one in that church looked away. Lucinda said her vows in the steady voice of a woman who has thought carefully about every word of them. She looked at Rhys when she said them, and he looked at her, with the unguarded expression, the one that had no management applied to it. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, here it is, after everything. After 9 years, and a ballroom, and a garden, and a morning room, and a library at midnight, and a supper table moved 3 feet to the left. Here it is. He said his vows in the same low, even voice. He said everything important, with a quality in it she had heard only in private, something more essential than tenderness, the quality of a man who has found the specific thing that was waiting to be found and is acknowledging it in the only formal language available. When the ceremony was done, Nora made a sound of deep personal fulfillment. Lord Fell cleared his throat in a manner that suggested he was experiencing unexpected emotion and was deeply irritated by it. The vicar smiled in the way of a man who has seen many weddings and knows what a good one looks like. And Lucinda Calloway, Duchess of Silverton, walked out of the church into the September morning on her husband's arm, and the sunlight came through the churchyard trees in bars of gold and amber, and she looked at the world with the face she had always had. The map of what she had survived, and all of her, and nothing apologized for. And the world looked back. Now here is something I want you to understand, because the legal reality of what happened that day matters as much as the romance of it. Under the laws of coverture that governed every married woman in England in 1824, that system of legal erasure I described at the start of our story, the moment Lucinda spoke her final vow, she ceased to exist as an independent legal entity. She became, in the eyes of English law, entirely her husband's. His name, his household, his legal responsibility. Her property, her potential income, any contracts she had previously entered, all of it passed to him. The Married Women's Property Act, that would eventually change this, would not reach Parliament for another 46 years, a full lifetime away. Rhys Calloway had spent 3 months with his solicitor ensuring that the practical reality of their marriage went as far as the law would allow. The settlements were detailed and specific. Her household authority was written out explicitly. She had read every clause, she had insisted on reading every clause, and he had sat beside her while she did it, and she had questioned 3 provisions and argued about 2 of them and compromised on both, and the solicitor had later told Lord Fell that it was the most thoroughly negotiated marriage settlement he had handled in 30 years of practice. It was not equality. By no modern measure was it anything close to equality, but it was the most that could be done within a legal structure designed to prevent it, by a man who understood that the world's limitations did not require him to replicate them within his own walls. That understanding, Lucinda would think about this many times in the years that followed, was its own kind of love. Quiet and specific and entirely reliable. She had not known before him that love could feel like reliability, like something you could place weight on without it giving way. She knew it now. A year after their marriage, at the Castleton ball, the same marble floors, the same chandeliers, the same ballroom where 9 years of cruelty and silence had played out, and where, on one May evening, a man had extended his hand and changed everything. Lucinda Calloway, Duchess of Silverton, walked in on her husband's arm and was laughing. She was telling him about the dispute at the estate school, the slates that had arrived on the wrong day. The conversation between the schoolmaster and the estate steward, the manner in which it had resolved itself, which she found genuinely funny. And he was listening with the specific, focused engagement that was his way of paying attention, which she had long since understood to mean that he was attending completely and would remember the detail of this conversation at some point in the next week and ask a follow-up question, which was one of the things about him she had discovered she loved. They walked into the Castleton ballroom. The room made its adjustment, the small, collective recalibration of people deciding how to position themselves, not the shock stillness of the first season after their engagement. That was past, had been past since the Northcott ball and the season that followed it, which had been the season of Lucinda Calloway's complete and unambiguous social rehabilitation. The adjustment now was something more ordinary and more permanent, simply the acknowledgement that she was here, fully and visibly, and that there was nothing to be done about that, and that attempting to do anything about it would be extremely inadvisable given who she had married. Lady Opal Drummond was present. She made no approach. Her invitations to the more significant entertainments of the season were, as they had been the season prior, and as they would be the season after, somewhat reduced in number. This was not, on examination, the result of any explicit campaign. It was simply the natural consequence of being on the wrong side of a reckoning in a world that had a long memory for such things. Lord Barton Fell appeared near the supper-room with champagne and the resigned expression of a man who has been forced to update his assessment of something. "You're both disgustingly content," he said. "We are," Rhys agreed. "It's honestly quite difficult to be around." "I've been told." Fell looked at Lucinda with the look of a man who is conceding something against his will and has decided to concede it gracefully, since the alternative is to concede it ungracefully. "He was insufferable before you," he said. "I want the record to reflect that. On the record. For posterity." "The record reflects it," Lucinda said. "I was not insufferable," Rhys said. "I have 17 witnesses," Fell said. 17. I counted. Lucinda looked up at Rhys. Rhys looked down at Lucinda. 2 seconds of that private language, the language of people who have found each other and learned all the words, and then she took his arm. "The supper-room?" she said. "The supper-room," he agreed. They walked in together, and Lord Fell was left with his champagne and his 17 witnesses, shaking his head in the manner of a man who is, despite all reasonable expectations, quite pleased with the outcome. Inside, they found a small table near the window. The supper-room was warm and bright with flowers and candlelight, and Rhys poured champagne, and they sat, and the waltz from the ballroom came through the walls, and she looked at him across the small table and thought about the first night they had dined alone at the long table. The ridiculous long table, 40 seats, inherited from a grandfather who apparently had 40 friends, and how she had moved her place-setting without thinking, and how he had looked at her when she did it. That look of complete recalibration that he still maintained was not astonishment. "What are you thinking about?" he said. "The dining table," she said. He considered this. Then the almost smile appeared. Fully this time, which was still rare enough to be remarkable, and which she had come to understand was one of the things she most specifically loved about him, its rarity making it count for more than 100 easy smiles would have. "You moved the place setting," he said. "You were astonished." "I was recalibrating." "You were astonished," she said, "and it was my favorite moment of the first month." He reached across the table and took her hand. He turned it over, the particular attention he gave to things he found specifically interesting, which included her hands, and his thumb moved across her palm, and she felt it move through her the way she always felt his touch, as though it was doing something to the architecture of her, finding the parts that had been in a defensive configuration for a long time and laying them carefully, one at a time, down. Come back to the ballroom with me, he said. She looked at him. I don't dance, she said. I know. He rose. He offered his hand. Come anyway. She took it. They walked back into the Castleton ballroom together, into the light of 100 candles, into the sound of the waltz that was still playing, into the room where 9 years had happened and where everything had changed. And she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and then they danced. She was better at it than she had remembered. 9 years of not dancing had not taken the knowledge from her body, and he was better at it than she had expected, which she told him. And he said, I was in the army for 7 years. We danced at every posting. It was either that or fall asleep at the officers' dinners. And she laughed again, which was, she thought, exactly right. That she should be laughing in the Castleton ballroom. That she should be here, laughing, in the very room where she had learned to hold herself still against cruelty, dancing with her husband, wearing her face exactly as it was, not one fraction of it hidden. It was the most specific and complete form of victory she could imagine. And Rhys Calloway danced with his wife in the candlelight, his hand at her waist, his eyes on her face, his full attention directed at exactly one thing, as it had been since a concert hall 3 years before their arrangement, and a garden and a morning room, and all the rest of it. And the room moved around them, and the music played, and society watched and understood without being told that this was what it looked like when a woman who had survived 9 years of being looked through was finally, completely, and irreversibly seen. And that is the story of Lucinda Vane, who bore her scars through 9 years of a world that asked her to be ashamed of them, and who refused, and who found in the end a man who sat beside her in a bright room and said, These are not damage. These are the map of what you survived. I am already working on the next story, and I want to tell you, it may be the most emotionally intense thing I have written yet. Subscribe so you do not miss it when it drops. And before you go, leave me a comment. Tell me where you were listening from tonight. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. Tell me what you are feeling. I read every single one. And I will see you very soon.